Hi, Shell Point. I'm Laura Slack, Director of Resident Life, sitting in for Terry Kolath, the Academy of Lifelong Learning. And we're here today with Professor Kerr to talk about a very special Academy presentation. And this one is a lunch and learn, and the topic is Japan. So the lunch will be Japanese influenced lunch. And it is Saturday, March 23rd in the Banyan Grill at Coastal Commons. So, Professor Kerr, welcome, and thank you so much for being here today. Tell us about this very special Lunch and Learn on Japan.
Thank you, Laura. It's great to be back at Shell Point. I love the Lunch and Learns. Japan is one of those curious countries that not many people have visited, but the influence of Japan is massive. And I'm going to take you through the early days of this island nation and take you right up to modern times. For most of its early history, Japan was a poor relation to China. China was the go-ahead large organization on its doorstep, and it dominated Chinese thinking, both spiritually, religiously, business-wise. And so for hundreds and hundreds of years, Japan was a shadow of the great neighbor next door. And then in the Middle Ages, it began to develop a culture really of its own. It borrowed Chinese writing, but we start to see some very interesting organizational changes. So, for instance, we have shoguns and emperors. The emperor naturally was the ruler, but the shogun was the military power, so they ruled side by side. And the shoguns were always fighting amongst themselves. The tribes were like the Scottish tribes. They had different membership, and we start to see the armed warriors of the Middle Ages appear who would do the fighting for them, and they were called samurai. And people say, where did they come from and why are they special? Of course, they're not that special, because meanwhile in Europe we had the knights. And the knights on the horseback with their armor. So you should look at them as the Japanese equivalent to the Western Knights. Oh. They coexisted at the same period for hundreds of years. And then the knights came out of fashion as technology developed, and likewise the samurai. There are also other fascinating things about Japan which are unique, like geisha girls, for instance, which I'll talk about the history of those. And the really sad time for Japan when they closed in on themselves, and the Portuguese and the Dutch and the French and the English were not welcomed. And China did exactly the same in the 19th century, and they lost 100 years of development because they didn't have the technology, and they were inferior in many ways to the West, and they suffered terribly until the middle of the 19th century. They couldn't really defend themselves, and we have the famous Perry visit, where he brought the great naval ships of the United States Navy and forced effectively Japan to open its doors in the late 19th century. And then it rejoined the international community, but it had this dichotomy in that its feet were in the Middle Ages and its head was in the 19th century. And of course that led to the famous Satsuma Revolt, and the movies have been made about it, about the samurai fighting their last battle against the modern Japanese army. And so the samurai faded away. So we see that from the early 20th century onwards, Japan has this desire to be a world power, and it develops its navy. And with its navy, it defeats the Russians, which is a shock to the whole world. And then it later, of course, invades China and Korea and dominates that part of the world. As I mentioned earlier, Japan has always had this dichotomy between a ruler in the form of an emperor and a military power. And so it was that the military power grew stronger and stronger in the 30s, and as a consequence of that, Pearl Harbor took place when they wanted to take the United States not so much out of the war, because no war had been announced at that time, but they wanted to warn the United States to keep out of China's influence in the Pacific. We know what happened after that, and eventually the bombs were dropped. And then there was a rebuilding phase of Japan. And that is the miracle of Japan, that with American support, they regrew their industries and almost exceeded some of the industrialization in the United States. So we see the Japanese electronics companies ruling the world, Sony and Panasonic and so on. And then what in the 60s was almost like a joke, the Japanese cars started to appear, and they were rusty and unreliable, and nobody took them seriously. And then they got it right, and now we take them very seriously. Yes. And so Japan had this tremendous leap forward throughout the 60s and 70s. And I'm going to take you through to the current situation of Japan, which is very distressing to the Japanese in that they are the most advanced nation who have this huge population issue. And can you believe it, that Japan's population is shrinking? The number of babies born to women has now dropped to the level of 1.3, 1.4. You need 2.1 to keep your population stable. So the population is declining and aging rapidly. And we all in the West are watching how Japan deals with this, because there are less people to make things and do things and pay for retirement folk. And so the new budget, if you like, from the Japanese government, only announced 2 months ago, is for the first time they're allowing people to come into Japan and actually work. And of course, we're all looking at how long will these guest workers be allowed to stay, and the Japanese are adamant they'll just stay for manufacturing, will leave after 5 years, but we know how that can go wrong. But we're all watching very carefully how Japan deals with this aging population, because we are following suit. We're right behind them.
Wow, that's amazing. Thank you so much, Professor Kerr. And if you too are interested in Japan, its history and legacy, please come to this very special Lunch and Learn on Saturday, March 23rd. It's at 11:45 in the banquet room, the Banyan Banquet Room at Coastal Commons. And the tickets are $35. And again, there's going to be a special Japanese lunch served. And it's the Academy Lunch and Learn Japan, its history and legacy, again on Saturday, March 23rd. So make sure you sign up. Seating is limited. Thank you again, Professor Kerr, and thank you, Shell Point.